Her mother worked double shifts to keep their home after her grandfather disappeared. When a homeless man walked into their kitchen one day, her mother fell to her knees when she saw his face. Chapter 1. The empty chair. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed open the front door of her apartment. The clock on her phone showed 11:43 a.m., way too early to be home from school. Her breath came in short gasps, just like it had in math class 20 minutes ago when the panic attack hit. "Not again," she whispered, dropping her backpack by the door. The empty apartment greeted her with familiar silence. Mom wouldn't be home from her hospital shift until late tonight. Sarah's legs felt weak as she made her way to the kitchen. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the empty chair at the head of the table. Grandpa's chair. 3 years had passed, but nobody had sat there since the morning he disappeared. "You want some of my special soup, princess?" His voice echoed in her memory as clear as that last morning. "Extra carrots, just how you like it?" Sarah gripped the back of his chair, the wood smooth and cool under her fingers. That morning had been so normal. Grandpa making his famous vegetable soup, telling his silly jokes, promising to take her to the park after school. But when she got home that afternoon, he was gone. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. The sound of her own ragged breathing brought her back to the present. Sarah forced herself to take deep breaths like the school counselor had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The panic slowly began to ease. She walked to the living room, where faded photographs covered the cracking walls. There he was, younger, stronger, standing proud in his army uniform. Another showed him holding baby Sarah, his salt and pepper hair already starting to turn white. In every picture, his eyes crinkled with joy, nothing like the worried expression she remembered from those last few weeks. The floor creaked under her feet as she moved closer to examine a particular photo, the last Christmas they'd spent together. Grandpa sat between Sarah and Mom on their old couch, all three wearing matching sweaters he'd bought them. They looked so happy. "Why did you leave us?" Sarah whispered to the photo. As always, it offered no answers. A sudden wave of exhaustion hit her. These anxiety attacks always left her drained. Sarah curled up on the couch, pulling the old Afghan blanket around her shoulders. The fabric still held a trace of Grandpa's cologne, or maybe that was just her imagination. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, the apartment was dark. The sound of keys in the door made her sit up quickly. "Sarah?" Mom's voice called out. "Why are all the lights off, baby?" Sarah heard her mother's footsteps approaching, followed by the click of the lamp. Light flooded the room, revealing Mom still in her nurse's scrubs, looking exhausted after another double shift. "What are you doing home?" Mom's forehead creased with worry as she sat beside Sarah. "The school called about another panic attack. That's the third one this month." "I'm sorry," Sarah mumbled, looking down at her hands. "I couldn't breathe. Mrs. Thompson wanted me to solve a problem on the board, and everyone was staring, and then I started thinking about Dash." She stopped herself. "About Grandpa?" Mom's voice softened. She pulled Sarah close, stroking her hair. "I know, baby. I think about him, too." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Mom stood up with a sigh. "I need to make some calls. Try to get some rest, okay?" Sarah pretended not to notice as Mom pulled a stack of envelopes from her bag. More bills, probably. She watched her mother disappear into the kitchen, closing the door behind her. But the walls were thin, and Sarah could still hear everything. "Yes, I understand the payment is late." Mom's voice cracked slightly. "I'm working double shifts. No, I don't have any other assets. Please, we just need a little more time." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself, trying to block out the sound of her mother's quiet sobs. The bank had been calling more often lately. Last week, a man in a suit had come to look at the apartment. Mom tried to hide it, but Sarah knew they were in trouble. Later that night, after Mom had gone to bed, Sarah crept into the kitchen. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor as she opened the cabinet where Grandpa used to keep his recipe box. The metal container was dusty now, but his handwriting was still clear on the index cards inside. She pulled out the card for his vegetable soup, the one he'd made that last morning. The paper was stained with old food spots, the corners worn from years of use. Sarah ran her fingers over the writing, remembering how he'd teach her to cook, measuring ingredients into her small hands. "The secret ingredient is love," he'd always say with a wink. But there had been no love in the way he'd abandoned them, leaving Mom to work herself to exhaustion trying to keep their home. Sarah's throat tightened as fresh tears threatened to fall. She put the recipe card back and closed the cabinet, but not before grabbing Grandpa's old sweater that still hung on the hook by the door. It was huge on her, the sleeves hanging well past her hands, but she didn't care. Back in her room, Sarah curled up in bed, burying her face in the worn fabric of the sweater. It wasn't fair. Grandpa had always been the strong one, the one who made everything better. How could he just walk away without a word? As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last thought was of that final morning. The smell of soup simmering on the stove, Grandpa's laugh echoing through the kitchen, his promise to return that afternoon. A promise he never kept. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 2:37 a.m., its red numbers casting a faint glow across the room. Somewhere in the apartment, a pipe rattled in the walls. The sound of distant traffic floated up from the street below. And in the darkness, Sarah held onto her grandfather's sweater, trying to remember the feeling of his arms around her, wondering if she'd ever understand why he'd chosen to disappear. "Sarah, could you stay after class for a moment?" Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the noise of students packing up their books. Sarah's stomach tightened as she watched her classmates file out of the math classroom. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty room. Mrs. Thompson sat down at the desk next to Sarah's, her face creased with concern. "Your mother told me about your grandfather," she said softly. "I wish I'd known earlier. These anxiety attacks you're having, they started around the time he disappeared, didn't they?" Sarah stared at her hands, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. 3 years ago, next week, and they're getting worse lately?" The sound of laughter drifted in from the hallway. Sarah swallowed hard. "The bank keeps calling Mom. I hear her crying at night." Mrs. Thompson sighed. "I noticed you've been sleeping in class. Are you getting enough rest at home?" "Mom works double shifts at the hospital now. Sometimes triple." Sarah's voice cracked. "I try to stay up until she gets home, just to make sure she's okay. That's a lot of responsibility for an 11-year-old. Mrs. Thompson pulled out a pink slip of paper and started writing. "I'm going to refer you to Ms. Garcia, our school counselor. She can help you develop some coping strategies for when you're feeling overwhelmed." Sarah took the paper without looking at it. She already had a stack of these referrals at home, stuffed in her desk drawer. Mom couldn't afford therapy, but she didn't want Mrs. Thompson to know that. The afternoon stretched endlessly ahead as Sarah walked home alone. Most days, she'd kill time at the library until Mom's shift ended, but today she needed to be home. The bank representative was coming at 4. The apartment felt different in the afternoon light. Shadows crept across the walls where the paint was peeling, making the old family photos look like they were floating in darkness. Sarah dropped her backpack and headed straight for the attic access in the hallway ceiling. The pull-down ladder creaked under her weight. Dust motes danced in the beam of sunlight from the single window as Sarah crawled into the cramped space. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each labeled in Grandpa's neat handwriting. Christmas, Army records, family photos. But Sarah was looking for something specific. She discovered it last week while hiding from another panic attack, a battered leather journal wedged behind an old suitcase. Grandpa's private journal. She shouldn't read it. She knew that, but the answers had to be somewhere, and Mom never talked about what happened. Sarah pulled the journal from its hiding place and opened it to the last few entries. "Lost everything today," she read aloud, the words catching in her throat. "The investment was a scam. All our savings gone. How do I tell them? Marie works so hard already, and Sarah." The next few lines were scratched out violently. Sarah flipped to the final entry, dated 3 days before he disappeared. "Can't sleep. Can't think straight. The shame is eating me alive. They'd be better off without Dash." The entry ended abruptly, a dark ink blot staining the page. The sound of the front door opening made Sarah jump. She quickly shoved the journal back in its hiding place and scrambled down the ladder. "Mom," she called out, but the heavy footsteps in the living room weren't her mother's. "Hello," a man's voice responded. "Mrs. Walker? I'm Richard Kent from First National Bank." Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped into the living room. The bank representative stood examining the family photos on the wall, his suit jacket draped over one arm. He turned when she entered, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Sarah. Is your mother home?" "She's working." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. "At the hospital?" Mr. Kent checked his watch with a frown. "We had an appointment scheduled for 4 o'clock. Sometimes emergencies come up at the hospital." Sarah tried to sound confident, like Mom did when she was handling difficult situations. "She can't always leave when she wants to." "I see." He pulled out a business card and placed it on the coffee table. "Please have her call me immediately. The situation with your mortgage is becoming critical." The word foreclosure floated through Sarah's mind. She'd seen it on one of the letters Mom tried to hide. Her throat felt tight again, the familiar panic starting to build. "We're trying," she whispered, but Mr. Kent was already heading for the door. After he left, Sarah sat in the growing darkness, waiting for Mom to come home. The business card seemed to glow on the coffee table, a reminder of all the things they were about to lose. It was past midnight when she heard Mom's key in the lock. Sarah pretended to be asleep on the couch as her mother's footsteps shuffled tiredly across the floor. "Sarah?" Mom's hand gently shook her shoulder. "Baby, why aren't you in bed?" Sarah opened her eyes. Mom looked exhausted, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled, dark circles under her eyes. "The bank man came." Mom's face fell. "I'm so sorry, baby. There was a multi-car accident, and we were short-staffed. I couldn't dash." She stopped, noticing the business card. "Did he say anything? That you need to call right away?" Sarah sat up, making room for Mom on the couch. "Are we going to lose the apartment?" "No," Mom said quickly, but her voice wavered. "We're just having a rough patch. I picked up some extra weekend shifts. Everything's going to be fine." Sarah knew she was lying. She heard Mom on the phone last night, begging her supervisor for more hours. "Maybe I could get a paper route or something." "Absolutely not." Mom pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Your job is to be a kid and do well in school. Let me handle the grown-up stuff." But Sarah didn't feel like a kid anymore. Not since the morning Grandpa vanished, leaving them with nothing but questions and unpaid bills. She thought about his journal in the attic, the desperate words scratched onto those pages. Had he known even then that he was going to leave? "Mom?" Sarah hesitated. "Do you ever wonder if Grandpa's still out there somewhere?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Mom's arms tightened around her slightly. "I don't know, baby." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I try not to think about it." But Sarah thought about it all the time. Every older man she passed on the street, every gray-haired customer at the grocery store, she couldn't help searching their faces, hoping to see her grandfather's familiar features. "I miss him," Sarah admitted, pressing her face into Mom's shoulder to hide her tears. "I know." Mom stroked her hair, just like she used to when Sarah was little. "I miss him too." They sat together in the darkness, neither wanting to move. Eventually, Mom's breathing deepened as exhaustion overtook her. Sarah carefully untangled herself and covered her mother with the Afghan blanket. In her own room, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of their struggling apartment building. Water running through pipes, the neighbor's TV, distant sirens. The business card from the bank seemed to burn in her mind like a warning. Tomorrow would be another day of trying to act normal at school, of pretending everything was fine, of holding back the panic that threatened to overwhelm her at any moment. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of her room, Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of her grandfather's absence. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the photo she kept there, the last picture ever taken of Grandpa. He was standing in their kitchen, stirring a pot of his famous soup, smiling at the camera without a hint of the turmoil he must have been feeling. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sarah whispered to the photo. "We could have helped you. We could have figured something out together." But like always, the only response was silence. Sarah's head pounded as she walked home from school. Another headache, the third one this week. The school nurse had suggested she try to eat lunch, but her stomach twisted at the mere thought of food. The autumn wind whipped through her jacket as she trudged up the street to their apartment building. A police siren wailed in the distance. 2 blocks away, construction workers jackhammered into the pavement, the noise drilling into her skull. Her phone buzzed, a text from Mom, "Working late again." Leftovers in fridge. Love you? Sarah sighed, fishing her keys from her backpack. At least she wouldn't have to pretend to be hungry at dinner. The lock clicked open, and she stepped into the quiet apartment. Except it wasn't quiet. A clattering sound came from the kitchen. Metal against metal. Something sizzling. The unmistakable smell of vegetable soup. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to shake. "Mom," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer, just more sounds from the kitchen. She should run. Call the police. Do something. Instead, her feet carried her forward, drawn by that familiar smell. Carrots, celery, her grandfather's secret blend of spices. The kitchen door was partially closed. Sarah pushed it open slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man stood at the stove, his back to her. Tall, thin, wearing ragged clothes that hung loose on his frame. Gray hair, matted and dirty, stuck out from under a worn baseball cap. He stirred something in their largest pot, humming softly to himself. Sarah's legs went weak. That tune, her grandfather's favorite song, the one he used to sing while cooking. The man must have sensed her presence. He turned, and Sarah's world tilted sideways. His face was gaunt, weathered, half hidden behind a scraggly gray beard. But those eyes, she'd know those eyes anywhere. "Grandpa." The word came out as a whisper. He blinked at her, confusion crossing his features. "The door was unlocked," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered it, yet somehow different. "Rougher. I hope you don't mind. Used to cook in a kitchen like this. Long time ago." Sarah gripped the door frame to keep from falling. This couldn't be real. She must be dreaming. Having another panic attack. Something. "You're not real," she managed to say. "You're gone. You left us." The man, her grandfather, turned back to the stove. "Soup's almost ready. Extra carrots. Important to remember that. Someone liked extra carrots." Sarah's phone slipped from her numbed fingers, clattering on the linoleum floor. The sound made him jump. "Shouldn't be here," he muttered, stirring the pot frantically. "Shouldn't have come. But the door and the kitchen looks like home." "This is home," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "This is your home. You lived here with us. With me and Mom." He shook his head, backing away from the stove. No. Can't be. Lost everything. Had to go. Had to." Sarah took a step forward. Her grandfather flinched. "You disappeared," she said. 3 years ago. You were making soup just like this. You promised to take me to the park after school. But when I came home, you were gone." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or fear. "The park," he repeated. "Swings. A little girl who loved the swings. That was me." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. "I'm Sarah, your granddaughter." He pressed his hands to his temples. "Sarah," he whispered. "Little Sarah, but not little anymore." "How long?" 3 years, she said again. "You've been gone 3 years." A tremor ran through his body. "The money," he said. "Lost it all. Couldn't face, couldn't tell." His words dissolved into confused mumbling. Sarah's phone buzzed on the floor. Another text from Mom. The sound seemed to snap her grandfather back to awareness. "Have to go," he said suddenly, pushing past her toward the door. "Shouldn't be here. Shouldn't have come." "No." Sarah grabbed his arm. The fabric of his jacket was thin, rough. She could feel how skinny he was beneath it. "You can't leave again. Please." He tried to pull away, but Sarah held on tight. "Mom's coming home soon. She needs to see you. Please, Grandpa. Please stay. Marie." Fear crossed his face. "No, can't see Marie. Can't face her. The shame." "She misses you," Sarah said desperately. "We both do. We don't care about the money. We just want you back." Her grandfather's legs seemed to give out. He sank into his old chair at the kitchen table, the one that had stood empty for 3 years. Sarah kept her hand on his arm, afraid he'd vanish if she let go. "Been living on the streets," he said quietly, staring at his trembling hands. "Can't remember much. Days blur together. But this kitchen, the soup recipe, something pulled me here." Sarah swallowed hard. "You still remember how to make it? Extra carrots, just like I always liked." "Sarah." He said her name again like he was testing it out. "My Sarah. Growing so tall now." He reached out hesitantly, then pulled his hand back. But so thin. Not eating right? A laugh that was half sob escaped her throat. Hard to eat when you're worried all the time. Shame filled his eyes. Did this to you. To Marie. My fault. All my fault. We can fix it, Sarah insisted. Together. Just stay. Please stay. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she picked it up. A text from Mom. On my way home. Emergency at work resolved. Be there in 20. Sarah's hands shook as she typed, Mom, come home now. Please. It's important. The response was immediate. What's wrong? Are you okay? Grandpa's here, she typed, the tears finally spilling over. He's in the kitchen, making soup. 3 dots appeared as Mom typed, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, don't move. Don't let him leave. I'm coming. Sarah looked at her grandfather, still sitting in his old chair, looking lost and fragile and nothing like the strong man in the photographs. But he was here. He was real. The soup bubbled on the stove, filling the kitchen with its familiar smell. Without thinking, Sarah moved to stir it, just like he taught her. Don't let it stick to the bottom, she said softly. No, he agreed, watching her with those haunted eyes. Never let it stick. They fell into silence. The only sound the gentle bubbling of the soup and their shared, shaky breathing. Sarah stirred, around and around, counting the minutes until Mom would arrive. Finally, she heard it keys in the lock, the front door opening. Sarah? Mom's voice, breathless from running. Her grandfather tried to stand, panic on his face, but Sarah grabbed his hand. Please, she whispered. Please stay. Footsteps approached the kitchen. The door swung open. Daddy. Mom's voice broke on the word. And then everything happened at once. Mom's purse hitting the floor. Her hands flying to her mouth. The sound of her knees hitting the linoleum as her legs gave out. Marie, Grandpa choked out. Baby girl, I'm so sorry. Sarah watched as her mother crawled across the floor, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her arms around her father's legs like a child. Where were you? Mom sobbed. Why did you leave us? Lost everything, he mumbled, his hands hovering uncertainly over Mom's shoulders. Your savings. Sarah's college fund. All gone. Couldn't face you. Couldn't. We don't care about the money. Mom's voice rose sharply. We thought you were dead. 3 years, Daddy. 3 years not knowing. Sarah moved to the stove, turning off the heat under the soup. Behind her, she heard her mother's sobs, her grandfather's broken apologies, 3 years of pain and loss pouring out of them both. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. And in the middle of it all, Sarah stood guard over her grandfather's soup, making sure it didn't burn, making sure he had a reason to stay. The kitchen lights buzzed overhead, harsh and fluorescent against the growing darkness outside. Mom still knelt on the floor, clutching Grandpa's legs, while he sat rigid in his chair, his hands shaking. Need to go, he muttered, trying to stand. Shouldn't be here. Made a mistake. No. Mom's grip tightened. You're not leaving again. I won't let you. Sarah watched from her position by the stove, her heart racing. Grandpa's eyes darted around the kitchen like a trapped animal's. The mission, he said suddenly, his voice different, harder. Have to complete the mission. The men are counting on me. Mom looked up, confusion mixing with her tears. What mission? Daddy, you've been retired from the Army for 30 years. He shook his head violently. Lieutenant Walker reporting. Serial number 47892. Need to reach the extraction point. Sarah, call 911, Mom said quietly, not taking her eyes off Grandpa. Something's wrong. Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed. The operator's voice seemed to come from far away. 911. What's your emergency? My grandfather, Sarah managed to say. We just found him after 3 years. He's confused. Talking about military missions, but he's been retired for dash. A sudden movement cut her off. Grandpa had shoved back from the table, breaking free of Mom's grip. Can't stay, he said, his voice rising. They'll find me. Take everything again. Can't let them find me. He lurched toward the door, but Mom scrambled to her feet, blocking his path. Daddy, please. You're safe here. No one's gonna hurt you. The bank, he said, his eyes wild. They took it all. Every penny. Trusted them. Stupid, stupid. Sarah spoke into the phone. Please hurry. He's trying to leave. We can't lose him again. Officers are en route, the operator assured her. Try to keep him calm. Don't attempt to physically restrain him. But Mom was already reaching for Grandpa's arm as he tried to push past her. Daddy, stop. You're having some kind of episode. You need help? No, he roared, the sound so unlike his usual gentle voice that Sarah flinched. Can't trust anyone. They all lie. All want to take. His words dissolved into confused mumbling as he pressed his hands to his head. Mom used the moment to grab his shoulders, trying to guide him back to the chair. That was a mistake. Grandpa's military training took over. He twisted free with surprising strength, shoving Mom aside. She stumbled, catching herself against the counter. Mom! Sarah dropped the phone, rushing to help her mother. The movement caught Grandpa's attention. For a moment, clarity seemed to flash in his eyes. Sarah, he whispered. Little Sarah? Yes, she said, holding out her hand. It's me, Grandpa. Please don't go. He took a step toward her, then stopped, confusion clouding his face again. No, not real. None of this is real. Have to get out. He turned toward the door, just as red and blue lights began flashing through the kitchen window. The sound of sirens filled the air. Police and paramedics, Mom said, her voice steadier now. They'll help us, Daddy. They'll help you get better. Police? Terror filled his face. No, they'll lock me up. Can't be locked up. Can't. He bolted for the door, but Sarah was faster. She threw herself against it, spreading her arms wide. Please, she begged. We just got you back. Don't leave us again. Heavy footsteps pounded up the apartment stairs. Someone knocked sharply on the front door. Police? Is everyone okay in there? Mom called back. In the kitchen. Please hurry. Grandpa backed away from the door, looking frantically around the kitchen. His eyes fell on the window above the sink. No, Sarah whispered, seeing his intention. Grandpa, we're 3 stories up. The front door burst open. 2 police officers appeared in the kitchen doorway, hands on their weapons. Sir, one officer said calmly, please step away from the window. Grandpa's hands gripped the sink edge. Have to complete the mission, he mumbled. Have to? What mission, sir? The officer took a careful step forward. Maybe we can help. The soup, Sarah said suddenly, remembering how it had drawn him here. Grandpa, the soup isn't finished. You always said never to leave a pot unfinished. Something flickered in his expression. His grip on the sink loosened slightly. Extra carrots, he said softly. Someone likes extra carrots? I do, Sarah said. Remember? You always added extra, just for me. He turned away from the window, his face crumpling. Sarah, my Sarah, what's happening to me? His legs gave out. The officers rushed forward, catching him before he hit the floor. Mom ran to him, cradling his head in her lap as he began to sob. Help is coming, Daddy. Everything's going to be okay. Paramedics arrived moments later, wheeling in a stretcher. They spoke in quiet, professional voices as they examined him. Signs of severe malnutrition, possible psychotic episode, cognitive dysfunction. Sarah watched as they helped him onto the stretcher, strapping him down gently but firmly. He didn't resist anymore. All the fight seemed to have drained out of him, leaving behind a frail, confused old man. I'll ride with him, Mom told the paramedics. She turned to Sarah. Baby, can you call Aunt Jenny? Ask her to come stay with you? Sarah shook her head. I want to come too. Sarah, please, Mom. I can't. I can't let him out of my sight. Not again. Mom hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but stay close to me. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and siren wails. Grandpa drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes recognizing them, sometimes talking about military missions from decades ago. Mom held his hand the whole way, whispering reassurances. In the emergency room, doctors and nurses swarmed around him, taking vital signs, drawing blood, asking endless questions. Mom answered what she could. No history of mental illness. Yes, he disappeared 3 years ago. No, we had no idea he was living on the streets. Sarah sat in a hard plastic chair, watching through the glass as they worked on her grandfather. Under the harsh hospital lights, she could see every detail she'd missed in the dim kitchen. How thin he was, the dirt ground into his skin, the badly healed cut above his eye. "Miss?" A nurse touched her shoulder gently. "Would you like some water?" Sarah shook her head. Her throat was too tight to swallow anything. Hours passed. Mom filled out paperwork. Doctors came and went, speaking in low voices about things like acute psychosis and cognitive evaluation. Police officers took statements about where they'd found him, his mental state, his 3-year absence. Finally, a doctor pulled Mom aside for a private conversation. Sarah strained to hear, catching fragments. Severe depression, memory issues, malnutrition. Need to keep him for observation. Mom's voice cracked. Will he get better? With proper treatment, time, and patience support system. Sarah stood up, her legs stiff from sitting so long. Through the window, she could see Grandpa sleeping, and 4 in his arm, monitors beeping steadily beside him. He looked smaller somehow, swallowed up by the hospital bed. "Sarah?" Mom appeared beside her, eyes red from crying. "They're going to keep him here for a while. Help him get better. Can we stay?" Mom wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "For a little while. Then we need to go home, get some rest. We can come back first thing tomorrow." Sarah pressed her hand against the glass, watching the rise and fall of her grandfather's chest. "He was really here. Different, broken, but here. He came back to us," she whispered. "He found his way home." Mom's arm tightened around her. "Yes, baby. He did. And this time, we're not letting him go." Outside the hospital window, dawn was breaking over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day, a new chance. A family fractured but finally whole again. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and Grandpa's soft breathing. Sarah sat in the visitor's chair, watching him sleep while Mom spoke with Dr. Chun in the hallway. 3 days had passed since they found him in their kitchen. The dirt and grime were gone now, his gray hair clean and trimmed. But his face remained gaunt, cheeks hollow beneath his newly trimmed beard. "Mr. Walker?" A nurse entered, carrying a tray. "Time for your medication." Grandpa's eyes fluttered open. He stared at the nurse, then at Sarah, confusion crossing his face before recognition set in. "Sarah," he said, voice rough from sleep. "You're still here?" "Of course I am." She moved closer to the bed. "Mom's here too, just outside." The nurse helped him sit up, handing him small paper cups, one with pills, one with water. His hands shook as he took them. Mom returned with Dr. Chun, a small woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. How are you feeling today?" "Tired," he mumbled. "Head's fuzzy." "That's normal with the medication, but it's helping to stabilize your thought patterns." Dr. Chun checked his vital signs on the monitor. "Your daughter tells me you were a financial advisor before retirement." Grandpa's hands clenched in the blanket. "Was? Before? Before what, Daddy?" Mom sat on the edge of the bed. "What happened to our savings?" He turned his face away. "Shame. So much shame." "Mr. Walker," Dr. Chun said gently, "talking about it can help. You're safe here." Sarah held her breath, watching her grandfather struggle with himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Man came to the office. Said he had inside information. Investment opportunity. Guaranteed returns." His words came faster now, tumbling out. "Should have known better. But the numbers looked so good. Thought I could double the savings, set up college fund for Sarah." Mom took his hand. "What happened then?" "Company was fake. All of it fake. Money gone. Everything we had." He choked on the words. "Your savings. Sarah's future. All gone because I was stupid, greedy." "How much?" Mom asked quietly. 200,000. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. "Life savings. Retirement. Everything." Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd never seen so much money, couldn't really imagine it. But she understood what it meant. All their financial problems, Mom's endless double shifts, the threat of losing their home. "Why didn't you tell us?" Mom's voice cracked. "We could have faced it together. Couldn't bear it. Your faces, disappointment, shame ate at me day and night." He pressed his hands to his temples. Started forgetting things. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't think straight. That's when you left? Sarah asked. He nodded. Walked out one morning. Kept walking. Days blurred together. Slept in shelters sometimes. Under bridges. Couldn't remember who I was most days. Just knew I'd done something terrible. Couldn't go home. Dr. Chin made notes on her tablet. You were experiencing a severe depressive episode, complicated by what appears to be stress-induced cognitive decline. The trauma of losing the money triggered a breakdown. But you remember us now? Sarah moved closer, needing to know. Sometimes clear, sometimes foggy. He reached for her hand. But your face, your voice, brought me back. Super SP2. Couldn't forget that. A knock at the door interrupted them. A tall woman in a business suit entered, carrying a leather briefcase. I'm Sophia Martinez, from Adult Protective Services. She introduced herself. Dr. Chin called me in to discuss Mr. Walker's case. Mom stiffened. What do you mean? Case question mark. Mrs. Walker, your father was living on the streets for 3 years, suffering from untreated mental illness. We need to ensure he'll have proper care and support moving forward. He has us, Sarah said firmly. He's coming home with us? Ms. Martinez smiled gently. It's not that simple. Your father needs professional help, ongoing medical care. And frankly, given your current financial situation, how do you know about our financial situation? Mom demanded. It's my job to know. You're behind on your mortgage, working multiple jobs, adding the responsibility of caring for your father. He's not a responsibility, Sarah interrupted. He's our family. Sarah, Mom touched her shoulder. Let's hear what Ms. Martinez has to say. The social worker opened her briefcase, pulling out documents. There are excellent assisted living facilities that specialize in cases like your father's. With his military benefits? No. Grandpa's voice was stronger than they'd heard it in days. No facilities. No institutions. Mr. Walker, please understand. I understand plenty. He struggled to sit up straighter. Lost myself once. Won't lose my family again. Dr. Chin stepped forward. Perhaps we could discuss a compromise? Outpatient treatment, regular therapy, medication management, but living at home with family support. Ms. Martinez frowned. The cost alone. Actually, Dr. Chun consulted her tablet. I've been reviewing the circumstances of Mr. Walker's financial loss. The investment firm that defrauded him. There was a class action lawsuit 2 years ago. Multiple victims came forward. Mom's head snapped up. What? The principals were convicted of running a Ponzi scheme. Restitution was ordered for all victims. Dr. Chin looked at Grandpa. Mr. Walker, you were entitled to compensation. But since you were unavailable, the funds have been held in trust. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. How much? Mom whispered. With interest and punitive damages, approximately $150,000. Sarah watched the color drain from her mother's face. That? Mom's voice shook. That would pay off the mortgage. Get Daddy the care he needs. Ms. Martinez closed her briefcase. Well, that certainly changes things. I'll need to file some paperwork, but with adequate financial resources and a strong support system. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was watching her grandfather's face as the news sank in. The shame that had haunted his eyes for days was fading, replaced by something else. Hope. Not my fault? He asked quietly. Not all my fault? No, Daddy. Mom was crying again, but smiling through her tears. You were a victim, and you've punished yourself long enough. Dr. Chin touched Ms. Martinez's arm. Perhaps we should give the family a moment? After they left, Sarah climbed onto the hospital bed, careful of the 4 lines. She curled up next to her grandfather like she used to do when she was little. Does this mean you're really coming home? She asked. He wrapped his arm around her, still thin but stronger than a few days ago. If you still want me? Always wanted you, Sarah whispered. Every day you were gone, Mom joined them on the bed, squeezing into the small space. None of them spoke for a long time, just holding each other, feeling the pieces of their broken family slowly starting to mend. Finally, Grandpa cleared his throat. Marie? That soup in the kitchen. Yes, Daddy. Didn't get to finish it. Been thinking. Maybe when I get home, we can make a fresh pot? Together? Sarah felt her mother's tears soaking into her shirt. Extra carrots? Mom asked. Extra carrots? He agreed, kissing the top of Sarah's head. Some things you never forget. Outside the hospital window, a flock of birds wheeled against the blue sky, free and together, finding their way home. Sarah woke to an empty hospital room. The chair where her mother had been sleeping was vacant, the blanket crumpled on the floor. Grandpa's bed, empty, sheets thrown back. Mom? She sat up from her makeshift bed on the waiting room couch. No answer. The nurse's station was busy with morning shift change. Sarah approached, her heart pounding. Excuse me? My grandfather? Robert Walker? He's not in his room. The nurse looked up from her computer. Let me check. Oh. Her face changed. Security. Everything happened fast after that. Hospital security swarming the halls. Mom running back from the cafeteria, coffee forgotten in her hand. What do you mean he's gone? Mom demanded. He can barely walk on his own. The morning nurse saw him about an hour ago, the security guard explained. Said he was agitated, talking about needing to leave. Before she could call for assistance, he pulled out his .4 and left the room. He's still weak, Dr. Chen said, rushing up to join them. He couldn't have gone far. Sarah's mind raced. Where would he go? Then she remembered the hospital had a garden. She'd seen it from his window, a small green space with benches and flowering shrubs. The garden, she said. He always loved gardens. Without waiting for the adults, she ran down the hallway toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard Mom calling her name, but she didn't stop. The garden was empty in the early morning light. Dead leaves skittered across the path, driven by a cold wind. Sarah walked slowly, checking behind every bush, every bench. There, hunched on a stone bench in the farthest corner, wearing only his hospital gown and robe, Grandpa sat with his head in his hands, shivering. They're coming for me, he mumbled as Sarah approached. Have to run. Have to hide? Nobody's coming for you, Sarah said softly. You're safe here. He looked up, his eyes wild. The shame. Can't wash it away. Follows me everywhere. Grandpa, please. You're sick. You need to come back inside. Can't face it. The looks. The pity. Better on the streets. Nobody looks at you there. Nobody knows what you did. Sarah heard footsteps behind her. Mom and Dr. Chen arriving with security. Daddy. Mom's voice shook. What are you doing out here? Marie. He pressed himself against the garden wall. Don't look at me. Don't. Mr. Walker. Dr. Chen stepped forward. You're having an episode. The medication is still stabilizing. Please let us help you back inside. No. He tried to stand but stumbled, weak from days in bed. Can't go back. Can't be locked up. Rather die on the streets than be locked up. Nobody's locking you up, Mom said. You're here because we love you. Because we want you to get better. Security guards moved to surround the bench. Grandpa saw them and panicked, trying to push past. Stop. Sarah moved between them. You're scaring him. She turned to her grandfather, holding out her hands. Remember the soup? In our kitchen? You came home because something inside you remembered. Remembered us. Remembered love. His breathing was ragged. The soup. Extra carrots. That's right. And when you get better, we'll make it again. Together. But you have to stay, Grandpa. You have to let them help you. He slumped back onto the bench. So tired, he whispered. So tired of running. Then stop running. Sarah took his cold hand in hers. Come home. Mom knelt beside them, wrapping her scarf around his shoulders. Please, Daddy, let us take care of you now. Slowly, the wild look faded from his eyes. He looked around, seeming to really see the garden for the first time. Cold out here, he said quietly. Yes, it is. Dr. Chen approached slowly. Shall we go back inside? Get you warmed up. He nodded, letting them help him stand. His legs buckled, and the security guards moved to support him. Sorry, he mumbled as they helped him toward the building. Don't know what came over me. It's okay, Dr. Chen assured him. It's part of the healing process. The important thing is you chose to stay. Back in his room, nurses checked his vital signs and reinserted his .4. Mom tucked extra blankets around him while Sarah held his hand. The money, he said suddenly. From the lawsuit. Don't deserve it. Yes, you do, Mom said firmly. You were a victim, Daddy. Just like the others they cheated. But I ran. Left you both. Years on the street. And now you're home. Sarah squeezed his hand. That's all that matters. Dr. Chen made notes in his chart. I'd like to adjust your medication slightly. These episodes should decrease as we find the right balance. Will they stop? He asked. The confusion? The fear? With time and treatment, yes. But you need to be patient with yourself. Recovery isn't a straight line. He closed his eyes. So tired of being afraid. Then let us be strong for you, Mom said. Like you were always strong for us. A social worker appeared in the doorway with forms, release papers, treatment plans, financial documents. Mom spent the next hour signing everything, making arrangements. We'll set up home health visits, the social worker explained. Weekly therapy, medication management. And of course, we'll help process the restitution claim. Grandpa dozed, the morning's excitement having drained his energy. Sarah watched his face as he slept, peaceful now, the fear gone. He'll really be okay? She asked Dr. Chen. With proper treatment and support, yes. But there will be hard days. Days when the confusion returns, when he wants to run again. We'll be ready, Mom said. We won't lose him again. Sarah thought about their kitchen at home, the empty chair at the table. Soon it wouldn't be empty anymore. Mom, she said, we need to go shopping before he comes home. Shopping? For soup ingredients. Extra carrots? Mom smiled, tears in her eyes. Extra carrots, she agreed. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Grandpa woke. He looked around the room, momentary panic crossing his face before he saw Sarah and Mom. You're still here, he said. Always, Sarah promised. As long as you stay, we stay. He reached for their hands, holding on tight. My girls, he whispered. My anchors. Outside the window, the garden where he'd tried to run was visible in the fading light. But he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at his family, his way home. Extra carrots, he said softly. Some things you never forget. Sarah laid her head on his shoulder, feeling his steady breathing, his solid presence. The fear might return. The confusion might cloud his mind again. But they would face it together, one day at a time, one pot of soup at a time, until he remembered, really remembered, that he was home. 2 weeks had passed since Grandpa's attempt to flee the hospital. The apartment felt different now, filled with new sounds. The shuffle of his slippers on the floor, the creak of his bed at night, the soft murmur of his voice as he worked with his therapist in the living room. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, doing her homework while Mom helped Grandpa sort his medications into a plastic organizer. Blue ones in the morning, he repeated carefully. White ones at night. That's right, Mom said. And the round yellow one with lunch. To help me think straight, he concentrated on placing each pill in its compartment. Don't want to forget again. Sarah watched them from the corner of her eye. Grandpa looked better, still thin, but his face had more color. The wild, haunted look rarely appeared in his eyes now. Sarah? His voice pulled her from her thoughts. What are you working on? Math homework. She pushed her textbook toward him. Fractions. He studied the page, his brow furrowing. Used to be good at math. Before. You're still good at math, Sarah said quickly. The doctor said your memory will keep improving. He nodded, but his hand started to shake slightly, a sign that anxiety was building. Mom noticed immediately. Why don't we take a break, she suggested. Time for your afternoon snack anyway. Soup, he asked hopefully. It had become their routine. A small bowl of soup every afternoon. Sometimes he helped make it. Sometimes he just watched, but it always seemed to calm him. Actually, Sarah closed her textbook. I was thinking maybe you could teach me the recipe today. Really teach me, step by step. His face lit up. You want to learn? Well, yeah. It's a family recipe, right? Someone needs to know it besides you. Mom squeezed his shoulder as she stood. I'll get the ingredients. They worked together at the counter, Grandpa directing Sarah's movements with growing confidence. Carrots first, he instructed. Cut them thick, they'll cook down. Sarah chopped carefully. Extra carrots, right? Always extra carrots. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Your favorite since you were little? Do you remember the first time you made it for me? He paused, concentrating. You were 4? No, 3. Had a cold. Wouldn't eat anything else. That's right. Mom called from the living room. She refused everything until Daddy made his soup. Then she wanted it every day for a week. Remember now? Grandpa nodded. You sat right there in that chair, feet couldn't touch the floor. Sarah added the carrots to the pot. What next? Celery. Onions. What the secret is love, Sarah finished with him. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Smart girl. Remember everything, don't you? Not everything. She stirred the pot. But the important things. The apartment filled with the familiar smell of simmering vegetables. Grandpa sat at the table, watching Sarah cook, occasionally calling out instructions. Timer, he said suddenly. Need a timer. Very important. Got it? Sarah set her phone for 45 minutes. Now we wait. He nodded, patting the chair next to him. Sarah sat down, noticing how his hands were steady now, the earlier anxiety gone. Sarah? His voice was different, clearer, more present. Been wanting to talk to you. About when I was gone? She held her breath, afraid to break this moment of lucidity. Okay. Most days I didn't know who I was, where I was. But sometimes at night, I dream about this kitchen, about you and your mom. Did you want to come home? Wanted to. But the shame. He took a shaky breath. Shame's a heavy thing. Weighs you down. Makes you forget what matters. But you found your way back. Something pulled me here. That day in the kitchen, wasn't thinking straight, but my feet knew the way. Like they remembered what my mind couldn't. Sarah thought about that day. How he'd been making the soup from memory even when he barely knew his own name. Dr. Chin says that's common, Mom said, joining them at the table. Muscle memory, emotional memory. They can persist even when other memories are clouded. Still cloudy sometimes, Grandpa admitted. Still get confused. But what, Daddy? But not as scary now. Not when I'm here. With you both. The timer on Sarah's phone chimed. She jumped up to check the soup, stirring it carefully. Smells right, Grandpa said approvingly. Ready for the seasoning? Show me? He stood, moving to the stove with more steadiness than he'd had in weeks. Little bit of this, pinch of that. Sarah watched his hands move, measuring spices without really measuring. How do you know how much? Feel it. Right here. He touched his heart. Some things you just know. The front door buzzer sounded. Mom went to answer it while Sarah and Grandpa finished the soup. Mr. Harrison is here, Mom announced, returning to the kitchen. Grandpa straightened his shoulders. The family's lawyer had been helping them process the restitution claim. Good news, Mr. Harrison said as he entered, briefcase in hand. The court has approved your claim. Full compensation plus interest. He spread documents across the table, forms to sign, accounts to set up. Mom read everything carefully while Grandpa watched, his hand finding Sarah's under the table. Once these are processed, the funds will be available within 2 weeks, Mr. Harrison explained. Enough to pay off the mortgage, cover medical expenses, and still have a comfortable cushion. The other victims, Grandpa spoke up. The ones from the lawsuit. Did they all get their money back? Most did, yes. Some, unfortunately, passed away before the case was resolved. Their families received the compensation. Grandpa's grip tightened on Sarah's hand. Could have been me, if I hadn't found my way back. But you did, Sarah said firmly. You're here now. That's what matters. Mr. Harrison gathered his papers. I'll file these first thing tomorrow. You've been through a lot, Mr. Walker. Time to focus on healing now. After he left, they sat around the table eating soup. Sarah watched her grandfather savor each spoonful, his movements deliberate, present. Good, she asked. Perfect. He smiled at her. You did good, teacher. Had a good teacher myself. That night, after Grandpa had taken his evening medication and gone to bed, Sarah found Mom sitting in the living room, looking at old photographs. He's really getting better, isn't he? Sarah asked. Mom pulled her close. Day by day. The doctors say his prognosis is good. The medication is working, therapy's helping. Having a stable environment, family support, it makes a huge difference. The money will help too. Yes, but that's not what's healing him. Mom kissed the top of her head. Love is doing that. Your love, especially. Sarah thought about the afternoon, teaching her grandfather his own soup recipe. He remembered more today. Clear memories, not just confused ones. I noticed. Mom smiled. You know what else I noticed? When he got anxious about the math, You knew exactly how to help him refocus. You're not just his granddaughter anymore. You're his anchor. Like the soup. Like the soup. Mom agreed. Some things you never forget. From down the hall, they heard Grandpa's voice. Marie? Sarah? They found him sitting up in bed, looking confused but not panicked. Just checking, he said. Making sure you're here. We're here, Daddy. Go back to sleep? He laid back, his eyes already closing. Extra carrots, he mumbled. Don't forget. We won't, Sarah promised, tucking the blanket around him. We'll never forget. As she followed Mom out of the room, Sarah paused in the doorway. The moonlight through the window fell across her grandfather's face, peaceful in sleep. The face she'd searched for in crowds for 3 years. The face she'd finally found in their kitchen. He was home. Different, changed, healing, but home. And this time, they'd make sure he stayed. The real estate agent's heels clicked on the hardwood floors as she led them through another house. This one's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Recently renovated kitchen, finished basement. Sarah watched her grandfather as he moved through the space. He seemed stronger today, more present. His therapist said familiar routines would help, and house hunting had become their new routine over the past week. What do you think, Daddy? Mom asked. Better than the last one? Grandpa ran his hand along the kitchen counter. Good bones. Solid construction. He paused at the window over the sink. Garden space in the back. Could grow vegetables. The agent smiled. The previous owners had quite a garden. The soil's already prepared. Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window. The backyard stretched out below, morning sun warming the empty flower beds. She could picture it. Tomatoes climbing trellises, carrots pushing through dark earth. We could grow our own carrots for the soup, she suggested. His face lit up. Fresh is better. Always said that, didn't I? You did? Mom joined them. You used to have that little garden plot at the community center, remember? Remember? He nodded slowly. Before everything went wrong, the agent tactfully moved to check something in another room, giving them privacy. Nothing's wrong now, Sarah said quickly. The lawyer called this morning, remember? The money's been transferred. We can afford this house. Our house, he said, testing the words. A fresh start? Mom squeezed his arm. What do you think? Should we make an offer? He looked around the kitchen again, then at the backyard. Sarah, you like it? I love it. Especially the window seat in the room upstairs. Perfect for reading. Marie, he turned to Mom. Your commute to the hospital. Actually, Mom smiled. I've been meaning to tell you both. I'm cutting back to regular shifts. No more doubles or triples. The compensation money means we don't have to struggle anymore. Grandpa's eyes filled with tears. I did that to you. Made you work so hard. No, Mom said firmly. What happened to our money wasn't your fault. And now it's been made right. Time to look forward, not back. The agent returned, papers in hand. Would you like to see the upstairs again? They toured the rest of the house. 3 bedrooms with large windows, a modern bathroom, plenty of storage space. Everything clean and bright and new. The owners are motivated to sell, the agent explained. If you're interested, we could have you moved in within a month. Mom looked at Grandpa. Daddy, what do you think? He stood straighter, more confident than they'd seen him in weeks. Make the offer. Everything moved quickly after that. Papers signed, inspection scheduled, boxes packed. The compensation money covered the cost of the house, with enough left over for new furniture and a comfortable emergency fund. Sarah helped Grandpa sort through his few possessions from the hospital. Clothes Mom had bought him, books from the therapy sessions, his medication organizer. Not much to pack, he said quietly. That's okay. Sarah folded another shirt. We'll fill the new house with new memories. He picked up his pill organizer, checking the compartments out of habit. Better memories. Clear ones. The medication was working well now. The confused episodes were rare, the panic attacks almost gone. He still had therapy twice a week, but the doctors were optimistic about his progress. Moving day arrived sunny and clear. Sarah watched from the front steps as movers loaded their belongings into a truck. Mom supervised while Grandpa stood in the kitchen, saying goodbye to the space where their family had found each other again. Ready? Sarah asked him. He nodded, running his hand along the counter one last time. Ready? The drive to the new house took 20 minutes. Sarah sat in the back seat with Grandpa while Mom followed the moving truck. Look, she pointed as they turned onto their new street. Mrs. Peterson, next door, already has her garden planted. Good soil in this neighborhood, he said. We'll have to get started soon if we want carrots by fall. At the house, the movers worked efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture inside. Mom directed traffic while Sarah and Grandpa explored the empty rooms. This one, he said, stopping at one of the bedrooms. This should be your room. Best light for studying? Sarah looked around the space. She could already picture where everything would go. Desk under the window, bookshelf along the wall, her grandfather's old sweater draped over the reading chair they'd bought. Help me unpack, she asked. They worked together, organizing books and clothes. Every few minutes, Sarah checked on him, watching for signs of anxiety or confusion. But he remained focused, present, even humming softly as they worked. Sarah? He held up a familiar metal box. Found your mom's recipe box. Put it in the kitchen, she suggested. Front and center, where it belongs. The kitchen was the last room they tackled. Mom had already unpacked the essentials: plates, cups, cooking utensils. The afternoon sun streamed through the window over the sink, warming the clean counters. First meal in our new home, Grandpa said. Has to be. Soup, Sarah finished with him. With extra carrots, they worked together like a well-practiced team. Sarah chopped vegetables while Grandpa measured seasonings. Mom set the table with their new dishes. Remember when you first taught me to cook? Sarah asked, standing on a chair to reach the counter. He smiled at the memory. So little then? Not so little anymore? No. He touched her cheek gently. Growing up strong. Like your mom. The soup simmered on the new stove, filling their new kitchen with familiar smells. Outside, the garden beds waited for planting. Inside, boxes waited to be unpacked. But right now, in this moment, everything felt perfect. First dinner in our new home, Mom announced, ladling soup into bowls. Should we make a toast? To fresh starts, Sarah suggested. To family, Mom added. Grandpa looked at them both, his eyes clear and bright. To coming home? Later that night, after the dishes were washed and put away in their new cupboards, Sarah found Grandpa standing at the kitchen window. The backyard was silver in the moonlight. Can't sleep? She asked. Just thinking. He turned to her. Remember what I said? About shame being heavy? I remember. Feels lighter now. Here, with you and your mom. The new house. The garden we'll plant. He took a deep breath. Feels like maybe I can forgive myself. Someday. Sarah hugged him, feeling his arms wrap around her, strong and steady. We already have. I know. He kissed the top of her head. That's what brought me back. What keeps me here? Mom appeared in the doorway, wearing her new robe. Everything okay? Everything's perfect, Sarah said. They stood together at the window, 3 generations of walkers in their new kitchen, looking out at their new beginning. The moon cast long shadows across the empty garden beds that would soon be full of vegetables, including, of course, extra carrots. Home, Grandpa whispered. Really home? And he was right. They were all home at last. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm patches on the breakfast table. Sarah sat with her math homework spread out before her, but her attention kept drifting to the garden outside, where Grandpa was carefully tending the young carrot shoots. 6 months had passed since they'd moved into the new house. 6 months of healing, of building new routines, of watching her grandfather grow stronger each day. Need help out there? She called through the open window. He looked up, smiling. The sun had tanned his once pale skin, and regular meals had filled out his hollow cheeks. Almost done. These carrots will be ready soon. Extra carrots? Always extra carrots. He straightened up, brushing dirt from his knees. How's the homework coming? Better now that I have the best math tutor. His therapy had revealed an unexpected benefit. As his mind cleared, his old skills returned. The financial advisor who had once managed millions now helped his granddaughter with fractions and percentages. The front door opened, and Mom's voice called out. Anyone home? In the kitchen, Sarah answered. Mom appeared, still in her nurse's scrubs, but looking refreshed after a normal 8-hour shift. No more exhausting doubles or triples. No more falling asleep in her chair. Perfect timing, Grandpa said, coming in through the back door. Soup's almost ready. The pot simmered on the stove, his famous recipe, made with vegetables from their own garden. The kitchen counter was lined with mason jars, ready for canning. Smells amazing, Daddy. Mom kissed his cheek. You're looking good today. Feeling good? He moved to stir the soup. Dr. Chin says I can reduce the medication again. Brain's healing. Sarah watched him at the stove, remembering that day 6 months ago when she'd found him in their old kitchen. The confused, frightened man from that day seemed like a distant memory now. Mail came, Mom said, pulling envelopes from her bag, including something from the therapy center. Grandpa wiped his hands on a towel before taking the envelope. Inside was a certificate decorated with a gold seal. Program completion, he read aloud. Full course of cognitive behavioral therapy. You did it. Sarah jumped up to hug him. Dr. Chin said you would. He held the certificate carefully, as if it might disappear. Long way from that hospital room. Very long way, Mom agreed. We should celebrate. Maybe invite the neighbors for dinner? The suggestion would have panicked him months ago, but now Grandpa nodded. Mrs. Peterson's been asking about my soup recipe. Speaking of neighbors, Sarah said, Mr. Rodriguez next door asked if you'd help him plan his vegetable garden. Said yours is the best on the block. Pride flickered across his face. Could do that. Got some extra seedlings started. The timer dinged, and they moved together in practiced harmony. Sarah getting bowls, Mom slicing fresh bread, Grandpa ladling soup with steady hands. Oh, Mom remembered, the photographer's coming tomorrow. For the family portraits. New pictures for new walls, Sarah said, looking at the frames they'd hung in the kitchen. Old photos mixed with new ones. Their first dinner in the new house. Grandpa and Sarah in the garden, Mom's birthday celebration last month. They sat down to eat, sunlight warming their backs through the window. Sarah watched her grandfather savor each spoonful of soup, present and aware in a way that still felt like a miracle. Remember that first bowl of soup? She asked. In our old kitchen? Parts of it, he admitted, was pretty confused that day. But I remember your voice. Remember feeling safe? You found your way home, Mom said softly. You both brought me home, he corrected. Kept me here when I wanted to run. Sarah thought about those early days, the hospital room, the garden escape attempt, the long nights of uncertainty. Were you scared? When you started remembering? He set down his spoon, considering. Terrified. Shame and fear got all mixed up in my head. Couldn't tell what was real sometimes. And now? Mom asked. Now? He looked around their bright kitchen, at the garden beyond the window, at the faces of his family. Now I know what's real. This is real. You're real. After lunch, Sarah helped him in the garden while Mom rested before her evening shift. They worked side by side, pulling weeds, checking the growing vegetables. Grandpa, she asked, patting soil around a tomato plant. Do you ever think about those 3 years? When you were gone? His hands stilled in the dirt. Sometimes. Getting clearer now with therapy. Not all of it, but enough. Was it very hard? Hardest part wasn't the cold or hunger. He sat back on his heels, looking at her directly. Hardest part was being lost inside my own head. Knowing I had a family somewhere, but not being able to find my way back. But you did find us? No, Sarah. He touched her cheek with a clean hand. You found me. That day in the kitchen, your voice broke through the fog. Brought me home. The afternoon passed quietly. They canned soup for winter, labeled each jar carefully. Mom came down ready for work, looking relaxed after a nap. Night shift tonight, she said, kissing them both goodbye. But I'll be home for breakfast. I'll have the coffee ready, Grandpa promised. After she left, Sarah and Grandpa sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the garden in gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of ripening vegetables and fresh-turned earth. Sarah? His voice was thoughtful. Been meaning to ask you something. What is it? Your anxiety attacks. Noticed you haven't had one in a while. She considered this. Not since we moved here, I think. Weight lifted off you too, HM? Yeah. She leaned against his shoulder. Guess we both needed healing. Inside, the phone rang. Sarah answered to find Dr. Chin on the line, calling to confirm tomorrow's checkup. How's he doing? The doctor asked. Sarah watched through the window as her grandfather watered the garden in the fading light. Really good, clear present. Making plans for the future. Wonderful progress. And you? How are you handling everything? I'm good. Really good. Sarah smiled. We all are. After hanging up, she joined Grandpa in the garden again. He was covering the tender plants against the cool night air. All tucked in? She asked. Safe and sound. He straightened up, looking at their thriving garden. Amazing what can grow with proper care. And love, Sarah added. The secret ingredient, remember? He laughed, a full, rich sound that still felt new and precious. Smart girl. Remember everything, don't you? The important things. They went inside together, closing the door on the darkening garden. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of fresh-baked bread and soup. Jars of vegetables lined the counters, ready for winter. Photos smiled down from the walls. Old memories preserved, new ones waiting to be made. Time for evening medication, Sarah reminded him. He took his pills without hesitation. No more fear, no more resistance. Just another part of the healing process. Thank you, he said suddenly. For what? For finding me, for bringing me home. He gestured at the kitchen, the garden beyond, the life they'd built together. For all of this, Sarah hugged him tight, feeling his strong arms around her, breathing in the familiar scent of garden soil and safety and home. Know what the best part is? She asked. What's that? She looked up at him, at the clear eyes and gentle smile of the grandfather she'd thought lost forever. We get to keep you this time. Yes, he agreed, holding her close. You get to keep me. Forever and always. Outside, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, grandfather and granddaughter stood in their warm kitchen, surrounded by the fruits of their garden and their love. The soup pot simmered gently on the stove, filling the air with the scent of carrots. Extra carrots, of course. Always extra carrots. Some things you never forget. And some things, once found, you never lose again.